Good morning and good afternoon, everyone. As the time has come, we are pleased to announce that the Japan Tourism Agency and the UNWTO Regional Support Office for Asia and the Pacific in Japan hold a webinar titled Addressing the Critical Need to Tourism Crisis Management, the Significance and Importance of Tourism Crisis Management, and How to Respond to Crisis. This webinar is co-hosted by the Asia Pacific Tourism Exchange Center and supported by the ASEAN Japan Center. Before we move on to the main topic of the webinar, we would like to inform you of 2 points. First, microphone and camera will be turned off throughout the webinar. Second, if you have any questions, please use the Zoom Q&A function at any time. The entire webinar will be recorded and made available on the Japan Tourism Agency and the UNWTO Regional Support Office for Asia and the Pacific in Japan websites later on. Thank you so much for your understanding in advance. Now I would like to begin. Mr. Tomohiro Kaneko, Vice Commissioner from International Tourism Division in Japan Tourism Agency of the Ministry of Land, Infrastructure, Transport, and Tourism, will deliver opening remarks on behalf of the organizers.
Good morning to all of you watching this webinar. I am Tomohiro Kaneko, Vice Commissioner of Japan Tourism Agency. I would like to say a few words on today's webinar titled Addressing the Critical Need to Tourism Crisis Management. First, I would like to express my sincere gratitude to the UNWTO office in Japan and all the persons involved in the preparation of this webinar, and also thanking all the participants for attending despite your busy schedules. Today, we are going to have a unique opportunity to hear from experts in tourism crisis management, as well as from knowledgeable colleagues at UNWTO and ASEAN headquarters, who will share their rich experiences and insight with us. Tourism crisis management is to improve the resilience of tourism by anticipating a crisis that will have a great impact on tourists and industries, and by planning and training in advance disaster mitigation measures and crisis countermeasures in order to minimize the damage. At the G20 Tourism Ministers meeting in 2019, our government took the lead in clearly stating the importance of crisis management in the tourism sector for the first time. Namely, since tourism is highly vulnerable to disasters, countries must share their knowledge and experiences to enhance the resilience of tourism. Based on this, G20 members have adopted the actions for strengthening the resiliency of tourism as Annex 2 of the Ministerial Declaration on Tourism. The Asia-Pacific region, including Japan, has so far experienced natural disasters such as earthquakes, typhoons, and volcanoes a number of times. Furthermore, global climate change may bring unprecedented disasters. Tourism industries have faced and will continue to face the physical as well as reputational damage caused by disasters. In addition, the protection of travelers in the event of a crisis is expected to be one of the most important roles that stakeholders in tourism destinations should play. The spread of the novel coronavirus has tremendously affected tourism-related businesses around the world since last year. The priority is to bring the infection under control as soon as possible, but on top of that, working towards recovery from this crisis is also a part of tourism crisis management. In this regard, looking ahead to the hosting of the Tokyo Olympics and Paralympics Games this summer, the gradual recovery of international tourist flow while preventing the spread of infection is an issue that Japan should tackle in cooperation with the public and private sectors. For example, our government will take the initiative in organizing package tours in which a small number of foreign tourists could participate, along with taking comprehensive infection control measures on the Japanese side. The Japan Tourism Agency and UNWTO office in Japan have collected, analyzed, and organized good practices in crisis response in Japan and overseas, and prepared a guidebook for local governments, DMOs, and tourism businesses to use as a reference when introducing tourism crisis management, as well as teaching materials and teaching materials for instructors to disseminate this information. Here in this webinar, we will introduce outlines and how to use them. I hope that you will find it very useful. Lastly, I'd like to conclude my remarks by wishing that this webinar, as well as the guidebooks and other materials, will be a catalyst for crisis analysis, consideration of countermeasures, and designing training framework in each country. Thank you very much for your attention and enjoy the webinar today.
In this webinar, we will welcome two keynote speakers who will talk about tourism crisis management. This webinar will feature experts from UNWTO headquarters and ASEAN Secretariat with keynote speeches to provide their insights on tourism crisis management. Dr. Dirk Glaesser, Director from Sustainable Development of Tourism Department of UNWTO Headquarters, will give us the keynote speech titled Crisis Communication, Communicating Amid Uncertainty. Since joining UNWTO in 1997, Dirk has held various positions, including Director of Tourism Risk Management, and is currently the Director of Sustainable Development of Tourism Department. In addition to UNWTO's Crisis Committee activities, he is currently working with WHO Information Network for Epidemic, ICAO's network of collaborative arrangement for the prevention and management of public health events in civil aviation, and World Travel and Tourism Council on a coordinated response to the COVID-19. So let's move on to his keynote speech. Dr. Dirk, the floor is yours.
Good day, my dear colleagues. I'm very sorry not being with you in person today, but happy to be invited to share UNWTO's thoughts on crisis management and crisis communications with you here today, and hoping through this presentation to lay the foundations for a better management in the future of crisis situations, better prevention, and a more sustainable and resilient tourism development. I will share now, with your permission, my screen and bring to you the work which WTO conducted in the past, preparing here the way how you, destinations, national tourism organizations, but also tourism stakeholders can benefit from the crisis communication toolbox UNWTO has prepared and made available for licensing, free of charge, but with a commitment to you. Crises occur, but it is the way how you have been preparing for them which will determine the impact on the tourism sector on you. Crisis management is a concept which emerged over the last decades. It was at the beginning something the tourism sector was not too fond of to deal with, but nowadays, not only because of the pandemic, it became a common technique in the tourism sector to use instruments and strategies to deal better with negative events and prevent that they are turning into a larger crisis. Crisis prevention, crisis management is also very important to ensure that the tourism development is sustainable and resilient. The tourism sector as such is an extremely volatile activity, having enormous impacts in destinations and on tourism companies. But at the same time, we see a constantly expanding tourism sector around the world, which brings more vulnerability in societies which are depending or over-depending on tourism. This is why it is important to deal with this subject in a structured and in a better understanding manner. Let me first remind you what we are talking about when we're speaking about the tourism product. It is predominantly immaterial. Immaterial means you cannot really touch it. It's a service product. You cannot really assess it by taking it into your hands. It is produced in the future. From the moment you are purchasing a tourism product and you are consuming it, there's a time gap in the future. But there's also distance between the place where you are contracting the tourism service and where you're actually consuming it. Consequently, the tourism product is a trust and belief product. In information economic terms, that is the most challenging product on sale. Trust and belief, and anything which is helping to increase the trust and belief during crisis times is of fundamental importance. The other thing to take into account when dealing with crisis management is that we are dealing in the tourism sector with a subjective risk perception. This is the most important element of the tourism decision process. I will illustrate you right now through a short example what that means. On this picture, you see a shark. A shark normally is in the risk perception associated with high risk. It is the fear of each and every beach holiday. At the same time, we noted globally 67 shark attacks in 2020. On average, we are counting 5 to 10 deaths per year. These are palm trees and coconuts. Coconuts are normally perceived to be of low risk. They are actually associated to be a symbol of holidays. We count every year globally around 150 deaths because of falling coconuts. So you see here in a sharp contrast between a high risk perception and a low risk perception and the objective risk actually associated with each of those. We in the tourism sector have to take care of that element because actually our tourism holidays is a very dominated product by the personal perceptions. This is important, especially for the dimension of crisis communications. Crisis communications is different to normal communications because of the quantitative and qualitative increasing requirements. Quantitatively, the number of contacts an organization has to manage. Qualitatively, the consistency of the statements and the facts which are disseminated. However, crisis communication grants the institution which is subject of it an increased attention. That is of enormous value if managed the right way, taking into account that normally people are only taking 2% of normal media information and 5% of advertising information note of. I go back in time at the beginning of Twitter to illustrate right now what the impacts of social media are in crisis times. First of all, you see here demonstrated through an accident, an air crash in Schiphol Airport, that there's a motivation to be the first to report about an incident and to make that known to a larger audience. You see here that individuals reported faster than official media. You see in the last tweet, Twitter beats BBC by 15 minutes in reporting. A motivation which also goes across all different formats. You see pictures, you see the maps, but you also see local TV and live stream of the tower. You see the passenger lists, you see foreign affairs, phone, telephone number, all different communication channels existing besides those directly affected from it, the company, the authorities, and the passengers. You also see that social media is the established source now for traditional media, where others are sourcing where others are consulting their sources from. You see here CNN in 2009 through this incident being actively looking for eyewitnesses and people to be interviewed from the event through Twitter. But you also see that there is a battle between traditional media and the social media reporters, where you see that here in the first time there's a contradiction, that the runway showed on traditional media, BBC, is actually not even displayed. You see here statements made out of the press conference when journalists from traditional media is observed making statements, and this made public. All these were developments which led us in UNWTO to develop a toolbox for crisis communications. Most of the crisis communication protocols which are existing have common elements. And it was our thought that instead of investing into rewriting the same generic guidelines over and over, it is for us much more helpful to prepare a generic set, a generic toolbox, which you then later on once licensed. And I said so before, our member states can license this crisis communication toolbox for free, but with the obligation to modify it, to tailor it to the specific needs of the circumstances of the country, to expand it and make it then again available to the stakeholders, so that crisis communication guidelines as such are widely available for the moments when you most need them. I take you through some of the elements contained in this crisis communication toolbox so that you understand the main structure. A crisis communication plan is an integral part of a crisis management plan and strategy of a company. It's basically centered around a crisis communications team, which has to be nominated and trained. Important is to fix over here the role of a spokesperson, which is interacting on behalf of the organization with the media. It is important to understand that besides communication, you have to establish a fact-finding procedure to produce over there the facts which you are later on communicating about the incident, about the crisis. You have to have a victim notification policy in place to interact professionally and responsibly with those affected by the incident. And you have to monitor and put procedures in place and to take this monitoring into your own communication plans to see what feedback you are getting, what are the articles written about the incident, and what are the implications of your communication strategy. One important element is the so-called mission statement, a description which is highlighting the purpose of the organization. It describes exactly why the organization exists, who are the stakeholders, what it hopes to accomplish, and for what objective. It is used during a crisis together with a fact sheet, the organization fact sheet, which is a concise 1 to 2 pages description on the organization, which is normally not available to the public, but regularly prepared so that it's staying ready for a crisis situation. It should be prepared before a crisis is happening. And then comes the position statement, an internal document as well, which outlines the organization's position on the specific event and is key to manage the communications strategy. It should be prepared at the beginning of the crisis, and this is the foundations of all the different press conferences and subsequent actions, statements made by the spokesperson and other staff of the affected organization. The holding statement is the initial public recognition that there is an incident showing that the organization is aware of that and sharing the objective facts which are known so far to the organization. It is important that in this holding statement there is no speculation, that it's the objectively known facts to the organization, and that more information will be gathered and shared once it is becoming available and validated. This could be an initial statement, which especially in times of social media is important to be issued quickly without major delay, and describing over here the rhythm, how the organization will share the information as it becomes available. The key messages are related to key issues which are coming from this current crisis. It follows the holding statement and speaks over here in more detail about the organization's concerns and actions to the event. It must be in harmony with the mission statement, as I mentioned at the beginning of these key tools. A press release is then the most common vehicle to communicate about the incident. It is then informing the press about what has been discovered by the organization, and it's ultimately not dealing only with the press, it is dealing with the end consumer, the traveler. Another document of importance to be prepared during times of crisis is the Q&A, the questions and answers, which are anticipating key questions of the audience, must be enabling the ones who are dealing then with the situation and communicating about it, must be relevant, efficient in the way it is written and being communicated, and consistent. As I mentioned before, the consistency cannot be stressed enough, as here is one of the major difficulties in crisis communications, to maintain the consistency between the different facts shared on the events. I give you now some additional factors, success factors in crisis communications, and one of them, starting with the delegation of authority, makes you clear how important it is to think not only in a hierarchical manner with a spokesperson, but also thinking about the different roles, how the communication channels can be then fed with the right information. It was the British embassy structure which first introduced over here the delegation of authority to rather junior persons in the embassies, enabling them to communicate directly and timely through social media about incidents. This event dates back a long time, but was the first time that we noted that this delegation of authority took place in through the communication channels. The other one is the ability to be precise and concise. I show that here with the same event I brought to you before on the air crash at Schiphol Airport, where you see that a person is, or the audience is, questioning the authority of a journalist. So you are from CNN. Notice that you just created the Twitter account today. That is definitely a long time ago, but the answer is symbolic. Yes, and we will spell your name correctly this time, which shows that the doubt was erased by a clear statement. Yes, we are the authorities. We are the ones sitting behind this account. We have over here the possibility and ability to deal with your questions and dealing with your questions related to credibility. Another factor of importance during crisis communication, and shouldn't be underestimated, because most of the events are reported visually, meaning by pictures, and responses are then textually, which puts the organization conducting this communication in a disadvantage and creates a disadvantage for the organization communicating about it. This has to be taken into account because pictures win over textual information. A motion picture is usually more effective than a still picture. But what still is not used sufficiently, but is technologically already quite quite commonly available are remotely controlled webcams, which will definitely win in the communication strategy over any other kind of information and communication source, because they are controlled by the consumer. They are controlled and have the possibility to be shared with others together with statements, and are a validation mechanism of the statements you are making in this particular field where you're dealing with subjective risk perceptions. The last thing I wanted to bring to your attention is the careful use of the word tourist, which too often in the communication channels are not properly taken care of and are associating unnecessarily negative events with the tourism sector, although the groups which have provoked the incident are not common tourists. It is therefore very important to very clearly stress that the person which was affected by an avalanche was not a normal skier or was not a normal tourist, but was somebody who did something extraordinary, which is not common. That means it is framed the right way, and that definitely will help limit the impacts on the tourism sector, on those which are conducting these activities in a destination in a different manner. So whenever possible, be specific, speaking about those affected, having triggered the event, and use over there very specific terms of it was a business traveler, an engineer, an adventure tourist, to limit the impacts of this incident on the tourism sector. The last thing I want to bring to your attention is the travel advice document which was adopted by the General Assembly of UNWTO, which shows over here and encourages destinations and authorities to make use of georeferenced information when it comes to reporting about events. Over there, the incident, making it understandable that it's not affecting an entire country, if it is not affecting an entire country, but at the same time also establish the principle of event information, not only asking countries, outbound countries, to take proper care in their travel advisories of georeferenced information, timestamps, and machine readable information, but also encourages destinations where the events are taking place to report in the same manner about the events, sharing objective data and facts about the incidents, so that this can be taken into account by the other outbound markets, especially here understanding that tour operators and others have legal obligations to report for tourists on those events that are shared. The more precise the communication can be, the more limited the impact can be. With that, I thank you very much for your attention, wish you a very good continuation of the discussions, and remain available here at UNWTO for you if there are further questions in the near future. Have a good day.